BIC is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, exchange of ideas, arts and culture. Today's program is STEMinism and Feminism, archiving women in science. What does it mean to be a feminist? And specifically, what does it mean to be a feminist in science studies? What does it mean to examine science at multiple levels, using the twin conceptual tools for feminism, gender and patriarchy? Furthermore, what does it mean to bring in intersectional perspectives to our understanding of science? Professor Gita Chadha will present the possibilities of critically reimagining institutional cultures in and around science. This lecture is part of the Obaid Siddiqi Lectures, annual lectures delivered by the Obaid Siddiqi Chair in History and Culture of Science at the Archives at NCBS. Before we begin, I'd like to request you all to switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent for the duration of the event. Please take a moment to do so now. I'd like to invite Deepika from NCBS to introduce the facilitator and the session.
Good evening to everyone here and welcome to this evening's program. Thank you all for being here and especially big thank you to the folks at BIC. I am a part of the team at the Archives at the National Center for Biological Sciences, or NCBS for short. NCBS is a research institute dedicated to the goal of understanding living systems across scales, from intracellular systems to ecosystems. And the Archives at NCBS is a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India, which basically means that we actively seek out, we collect and we preserve material across all STEM fields and from across the country. We preserve items like photos, letters, documents, scientific instruments, and other kinds of artifacts from individual scientists, organizations, people's movements, and much more. And if you'd like to learn more about us, please do visit the Archives website, archives.ncbs.res.in, or come over and visit us in person. We'd love to have you. We're open to the public. We're available from Monday to Friday from 10 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the position of the Obaid Siddiqi Chair. It's named after Obaid Siddiqi, the renowned biologist whose sustained vision led to the development and the founding of NCBS. And this chair is supported by the TNQ Foundation. Every year, the chair is awarded to a distinguished scholar with a substantial body of work that deepens our understanding of the history and the culture of science. And these scholars are known for transcending disciplinary boundaries in their work and engaging with the public. In the past, we've had Dr. M.D. Madhusudan and Dr. G.N. Devi as chairs. This year we have Dr. Gita Chadha. The chairs also work closely with the Archives at NCBS to reimagine the role of the archive in both academic and public spaces. This year, Professor Gita Chadha has served as the third Obaid Siddiqi Chair, initiating deep conversations about the practice, method, and the social construction of scientific knowledge. Today's lecture is the second in an exciting series of lectures that round off Gita's term as chair at NCBS. Yesterday, we kicked off the series with a talk at Surana College in Jayanagar, in which Gita discussed the contours of her field, which is Feminist Science Studies. And tomorrow, the final talk in the series will be at NCBS at 4 p.m. And we'd love to have, it would be great if we could see some of you at NCBS tomorrow. Tomorrow's talk is titled A Feminist Unpacking of the Man of Science. For now, I'll hand over to Professor Uma Ramakrishnan, a senior professor at NCBS. She'll introduce you to Gita and more about her work.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Uma. I work at NCBS and it's a real honor and privilege to introduce Gita to all of you today. So Professor Gita Chadha is a visiting professor at Azim Premji University and holds, as Deepika said, the Obaid Siddiqi Chair at NCBS for 2023-24. She's formerly a faculty member at the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai, and she has a doctorate in sociology and has taught at Mumbai University and the University of London's International Program in Mumbai. She chaired the Women's Development Center at the University of Mumbai from 2016 to 2020. She's developed frameworks for feminist archiving at SNDT Women's University Mumbai and designed a pioneering course in Feminist Science Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. She actually also taught a feminist science course at NCBS, which our students really enjoyed. Her research interests include science studies, feminist theories, and post-colonial studies. She has co-edited volumes titled Feminists and Science, 0 Point Bombay, and Reimagining Sociology in India, Feminist Perspectives. She has edited special issues for contributions to Indian sociology, the Review of Women's Studies of the Economic and Political Weekly, and EPW Engage. Her recent volume, Mapping Scientific Method, Disciplinary Narrations, is co-edited with Rennie Thomas and published by Ruturaj. She has collaborated with women artists and poets to promote feminist art practices in India, and she regularly writes on these issues. I, for one, have really enjoyed having her at NCBS this past year, and really excited, like all of you, I'm sure are, to hear what she has to share with us today. Welcome.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can the light be a little less on my eyes? Just a little? I think that's much better. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to see you here today. I'd like to start by thanking the NCBS for instituting the Siddiqi Chair and for inviting me to apply for it and offering this position to me. It has been a wonderful opportunity. My particular thanks are to the archives at NCBS, Venkat and his entire team, and also thanks to BIC for this hosting this evening. I've been a little unwell. I hate sitting like this and reading out. I prefer to be there, but I thought it would be safer if I'm here. So I have a text piece. It'll take me about 40 to 45 minutes to actually read it, and I hope that you will bear with it. Next slide, please. I want to start. Can we have the next slide? Yeah. So I want to start with this image that the artist Taylor Ramchandra actually produced for this set of talks. Some of the images that she shared with me and with Deepika. In the beginning, had women in laboratories solving equations, and there were other also very interesting images. I was a bit uncomfortable because I thought that it's very standard to present women in science, doing science. What we've been doing in the last 1 year, women PIs in NCBS and me, and also the conversations of the last 20-25 years in the field of feminist science studies have a different flavor. They have a flavor which is somewhat like this, which is Alice in Wonderland, Mad Hatter Tea Party, with women sitting together at leisure, talking, releasing their thoughts, sharing with each other. You can feel the immense laughter, the joy. So we worked with this idea, and I'm really thankful for this image that Gita has used. instead of seeing the women that I interviewed, you will find them. There's Uma's tiger there, there's Vatsala's zebrafish, there's Hia's mouse. Generally, plants, animals, and the world of nature that I think my respondents engage with magically, rather than just equations and laboratory work. So I'd like to thank Megha for this. Next slide, please. I was struggling to get the pitch right for these talks because they're aimed at very different constituencies. I want you to be with this long quote for the entire evening, a quote by Gita Chadha, who is one of my absolutely favorite anthropologists, feminist, post-structuralist. Do take a second to read it and be with it. Gita Chadha, of course, worked extensively with the Bedouin women, and she obviously went with more power and privilege in her bag than I do when I come to an institution of like NCBS, which is actually an institution of power, privilege, prestige. And I, as a researcher anthropologist, actually am the one who is at the margins. Yeah? So, as Deepika said, yesterday, I set out what I think are the origins and contours of the field of feminist science studies. Today, I present some thoughts, material, and reflections on one of the contours of feminist science studies, which is how to collect, document, and archive the experiences of women in science, how to go beyond numbers into the collection of narratives, stories, and biographies. The portmanteau word STEMinism makes me uneasy. STEMinism very nobly is a term that is used to describe the move to bring more women into science, technology, engineering, and maths, with the belief that this is essentially empowering and liberating for the women, and that it will help the scientific institutions in fulfilling the DEI mandate, but also in providing the mass often second line base to the scientific workforce. While we as feminists should have no problem with this approach in principle, we find ourselves questioning some of it. Let me explain why. First, as I said yesterday, the field of feminist science studies, a feminist understanding of questions of the relationship between gender and science, is an attempt to develop critiques of science, particularly the patriarchal structures within its text and its practice, and the consequences of this on our world. In this context, I cited my co-traveler in FSS, Asha Chutan, who says that critique is different from criticism. Critique aims, she says, and we all agree, at suggesting and developing alternative models. Criticism does not do that. She says, and I quote her, FSS for me is not about criticism, but about critique. But about critique, which means generating alternative knowledge models. It is, she says, about asking different questions, reflecting on disciplinary histories and practices, looking at how feminists have transformed some of this from within their own disciplinary domains. My submission is that STEMinism sets its boundaries on the outside without ensuring that the alternative questions within these fields get asked. It is an attempt at bringing more women into science without critiquing the fields of science. That is why we need to be careful to distinguish between the two projects of STEMinism and feminism and resist attempts to think that they meet the same mandate. Second, STEMinism clubs the disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and maths, also medicine, together. It reproduces the silos and, in a sense, also the privilege of these fields within the academic and professional sites of higher education institutions. And as I said yesterday, one of the contours of SSS as a field has been the attempt to break these silos, cross and transgress the disciplinary boundaries to actually bring forth an integral and interdisciplinary approach to the study of the world. In both these senses, then, I would urge ourselves to refrain from a quick conflation between the project of bringing more women into science and the project of feminism, which we suggest is much larger. Here, let me once again use the same quote from Sandra Harding that I did yesterday, and I do very often, to indicate that FSS is envisioned as a much broader project. Harding says, and I quote, "All versions of the scientific worldview take science to be a totalizing theory. It has been assumed that anything and everything worth understanding can be explained or interpreted within the assumptions of modern science. Yet, there is another world hidden from the consciousness of science, the world of emotions, feelings, political values, of the individual and collective unconscious, of social and historical particularity, explored by novels, drama, poetry, music and art, within which we all live most of our waking and dreaming hours under constant threat of its increasing infusion by scientific rationality. Part of the project of feminism, she says, is to reveal the relationship between the two worlds and how each shapes and forms the other." Much of my earlier work and my work at NCBS this past year is about trying to till the soil for bringing these worlds closer. When I was invited to apply for the OS chair and also given the position, my response was one, surprise, and two, relief. My natural response was to think of NCBS as my field, especially since the TIFR Mumbai had been my home come field for 26 years. The difference, though, was significant. Here, I was asked to do my work. There, I had scavenged to do it. Imagine then my wonder at how a field like FSS has developed and gained credibility over the decades. I take this opportunity to doff my hat to those on the selection committee. Now, an important framing principle of my work has been a feminist consciousness that makes one smell erasures and detect fingerprints, which are often missed by others. My first walk into the NCBS archives was exhilarating. The smells, the silence, the books, the shelves in what was Obaid Siddiqi's room on the ground floor felt like Alice's rabbit hole. The old computer that sat wonderfully around with the new equipment, the meticulously arranged collections, and the histories they contained had the power to open magical worlds for any Alice that might choose to fall into it on a dream walk. Ravi sitting relentlessly at his computer, Ojas peering into his, Sindhu steeped into her conservation work, lent an interesting gravitas to the process of what an archive does. As I was shown into the proud collection of M.S. Swaminathan, Leslie Coleman, Obaid Siddiqui, K.S. Krishnan, the Alice in me jumped up, became humongous in size, and explained with immense curiosity, "Where is Veronica?" Veronica Rodrigues, developmental biologist, who worked actually with the Drosophila, which is exactly what also Siddiqui worked with. The Veronica who some knew as a kind soul and others knew as a terror. Veronica, the single woman, always in pants and a blue or green jumper worn above her unironed shirt. Veronica, who participated in our residential drive for the Gujarat raid victims on the TIFR Mumbai campus. Veronica, who came from Kenya. Veronica of the famous letter of 1990 that she addressed to the then dean at TIFR, asking that the prefix of Srimati as a form of address for women be dropped in official communication. I was looking for Veronica. I was sure to be shown a nice, carefully curated Veronica file with a yellowing paper, old photographs, happily present with her colleagues. I was told we don't have a collection for Veronica. Veronica is everywhere. She is in Obaid's files, in a letter, in Krishnan file, in another letter. She was also present in the artworks done by young Anuja Rosalkar. A little surprised, I became keen on the idea of making a documentary on the life of Veronica, or as Venkat suggested, of digital ways of opening up her story. While none of this happened as yet, we started a series of conversations at the archives about the difficulties of building conventional collections on women, their lives, that evade documents and papers. Listening to Venkat, to Deepika, to Anjali, made me recognize the need to rethink archiving as a discipline, to see that the act of research, to my mind, is an act of archiving and vice versa, to see the history of feminist archiving and the history of the women's movement, to ponder over how to operationalize feminist archiving, and most importantly, how to persuade the funders that oral histories make collections, that 5 photographs or a few artifacts or a few letters might be considered as valuable collections. I was relieved to find so much resonance with the archives team in understanding that feminist archiving, like feminist building of any other discipline, is not only about finding ways to honor the lives of women, but it also goes much beyond that to actually transform the discipline itself. As Michelle Caswell says in an article that Deepika brought to the table, as such, feminist standpoint appraisal explicitly and unapologetically gives epistemological weight, therefore assigning value to records created and preserved by and potentially activated in service to those individuals and communities oppressed by capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Furthermore, feminist standpoint appraisal shifts our thinking about the position of the archivist from a purportedly objective view from nowhere, which in fact belies a dominant but unnamed white male position, towards a socially located, culturally situated agent who centers ways of being and knowing from the margins. In valuing the unique insights gleaned by people on the margins, feminist standpoint appraisal refuses the notion that archivists from oppressed communities must overcome their positionalities to meet institutional goals and professional demands of neutrality, but rather values and leverages the insights gained from the outsider status, viewing the attendant insights as assets rather than as determinants to the archival endeavor. Furthermore, she says, feminist standpoint appraisal calls on archivists who inhabit dominant identities to acknowledge their oppressive standpoints and actively work to dismantle them. And as Marika Sifo and Stacey Wood say in the conclusion of their article, Critical Feminism in the Archives, again brought to the table by the team, the archival field is currently and perpetually faced with financial precarity, something that I've been hearing about almost regularly at not just NCBS, but various institutions that try to run archives. Technological challenges and institutional politics. They also say that the epistemological foundations of archival theory are not adequate for our political ideals or practical challenges, and that we need to take seriously the critiques of power coming from outside of archival studies as well as from within. This would give you a sense of the drift of the discussions that we had at the archives, and which I'm sure will continue. Within the field space of NCBS, while it was not unusual to encounter the term feminism, especially because I was brought in to strengthen my work in feminist science studies, negotiating my use of the term was interesting. My early discussion with key informants, as I considered the possibility of using the term in the title of the course I intended to teach, led to the following observations. A. Use of the term might put off potential enrollments for the course. B, NCBS is woke enough for that not to happen. My decision to use the term came out of a personal decision to visualize the term. It became inevitable, somewhat urgent for me to use the term unapologetically and somewhat audaciously, because like many other feminists or women against patriarchy, while it is tempting to take the position, don't call it that, don't label it, do the work without a prefix, it is also important to openly attribute a way of thinking, a way of doing to the right historical context. Not naming feminism was not an option I chose. Not naming it felt in analogy like saying, one can change one's surname in marriage. How does it matter? As long as you don't compromise on your autonomy. Using the term in the course title did not seem to have any apparent impact on enrollment in either direction. In the first classes, the students shared the reasons for opting for the course. It seemed that the use of the term had in fact appealed to the small section who were either confirmed feminists or at least open to engaging or at the bare minimum interested. I pushed for some more emboldenment in the use of the term feminism on campus in the couple of events we organized while navigating my own need to speak of science, for instance, the scientific temper, in more generic ways. While my own early and even current interests in the field of feminist science studies were on examining the ontological and epistemological assumptions made by modern Western science and seeking to unravel the gendered components in some of these, I soon realized how deeply connected these were to the question of where were the women in science, what were they doing, and what was their experience of being in science. The existing literature was scanty and spread wide. Maitreyi Krishnaraj in her book Women in Science and in her later writings had spoken of the social dimensions of science, its ethical concerns, and also feminist critiques. She advocated for socially progressive values to shape scientific inquiry and justification. This was somewhere in the 80s. Lalita Subramanian's Women Scientists in the Third World, the Indian experience, seen as a unique collective biography of women scholars in the hard sciences at the University of Chennai, is an ethnographic case study that combines a comprehensive description of the lives and careers of individual women who struggle in a male-dominated workplace that marginalizes them. It also gives us an analysis of the structures and organizational features that serve to maintain them in that peripheral position. A 2005 study done by Meena Gopal and Meena Punacha called Women in Science, an examination of women's access to and retention in scientific careers, is concerned with the question of gender equity in access to and retention in science, education and careers. It is based on 149 women's interviews with 149 women scientists and 147 women students across a broad spectrum of institutions in the country. Neelam Kumar's Gender in Science Studies across cultures includes essays from international women in science who address discrimination and the role that gender plays in science. Abha Sood's short biography of Anna Mani became a classic text in biographical retrievals. And biographical retrievals sometimes are difficult to do because you are dealing with a different time, a different context. Often we wonder, is it possible to do feminist reading of women who didn't call themselves feminist? It is a very big dilemma about how to go about doing that. Savitri Preeta Nayar's recent work on Janaki Ammal is a welcome addition to archiving women's lives through individual biographies. As we push the field further, and Savitri is the next Obaid Siddiqi chair, and I hope that some of the work there in Ephesus will be carried further. As we push the field further, we realize that we must go beyond the question of numbers into the living narratives, into the stories, into the anecdotes, the memories. Through our deliberation, there seems to be an implicit consensus emerging. We need to go beyond setting up role models for women to enter science, which both the state and the community often tend to do. We also seek very tentatively to raise questions on the nature of science, whether biology or physics or chemistry or maths, and how it might be bent with feminist standpoints, as we have done in literature, history, sociology, even economics and psychology. It is with this intention that I curated the PI interviews, both the YouTube ones and the archived ones at NCBS. I'd submit that while the conversations most definitely affirm the gendered culture of science, the questions around the nature of science are slow to becoming accepted. These interviews were done with women PIs. As I embarked on what I think is building a living archives of women in science, with curated interviews with women PIs at NCBS, there are 10 out of 30, which is supposed to be one of the better figures in Indian science institutions. I faced interesting situations, from those who shied away from public interviews to those who might have thought that this is an exercise in publicity and PR, to those who just did not find the time to do this over their important commitment to doing their science or fulfilling their institutional responsibilities. I obviously did not want to overburden them. Those who did give the interviews, both for YouTube and for the archives, surprised me with some careful audacity from them. None of the interviews are badass, but all of them are honest attempts at pushing the envelope, the boundaries to say much. The YouTube interviews, Deepa's interviews have 839 views, Getty's has 443, Hia's has 267, Solamini's has 404, Uma's has 362, Vatsala's has 378, and it was quite interesting to keep going back to the interviews and saying, okay, how many views, how many likes, are there comments? Something very, very new for me, and something that the team, the communication and outreach team actually did wonderfully with me. The questions that I had for the YouTube interviews and also for the archival one, here I will basically speak about the YouTube interviews. The questions were, and with the intention that hopefully all of you will go and see them and we'll get at least 20 more likes today. The questions were feminist, from seeking thick descriptions of their personal journeys into science to their experiences in science. While the focus was on science and what it does wrong, a shift that women in science in the last decade have already done. Let me explain this. Till about 15 years back, what we saw, or even, is that a lot of women in science and associations promoting women's equal representation in science, taking up issues of equity within science, have actually changed the narrative from the earlier women in science narrative, which was to say that you don't see women in science, they get discriminated because of their dual role. They have to perform roles as homemakers, caregivers, and they can't really do therefore their science very well, and that is the reason why they don't make it. That is the reason why there is a glass ceiling, that is the reason why they don't get the awards, that is the reason for XYZ. We in Feminist Science Studies pushed that to say that that might be the case, but let's look at what is wrong with science. What is science doing actually, contributing to this low representation of women in science? And I think that in the last 15-20 years, women scientists themselves have started taking up these issues and looking at where the problem lies in science. And notable amongst the figures that have done that are Rohini Godbole, Prajwat Shastri, Shobna Narasimhan. So they're doing a lot of very, very good, significant work to improve scientific institutions and their cultures for women. My interviews threw up some fresh ideas. I pulled out three important ones for today. One is sexual harassment, second is toxicity in women, and third is a disciplinary discourse. Now these interviews are rich, and if you listen to them on YouTube, I know a young friend of mine has been listening to it and has been constantly sending messages saying how important these conversations are. If you really listen to these interviews, they have immense nuance and immense, it's very rich material. it's almost impossible to try and report it, quote unquote, in one talk. It will require several layers of analysis, several layers of theoretical work for us to be able to very fully understand the nuance. At the moment, they're just extremely enjoyable. Please listen to them. I actually pulled out these three ideas because I think that they were probably a little different from what women in science have been talking in the public domain so far. So why did I ask the question, for example, on sexual harassment? During the hashtag #MeToo movement, we noticed that, in India particularly, that a cross-section of men in academia were named. And as we were following the movement, we noticed that there was really no mention of men in science. Are men in science not sexual predators? I lived on a campus for 26 years and the whispers are immense. We knew about it. Then why were the naming not happening? And the thing that we recognized is that it's very difficult for young women or young faculty members, particularly young students, to report any of these cases of sexual harassment, because if they go to the ICs, what happens then is that they might be assigned to another laboratory, and when they are assigned to another laboratory, they lose access to the work that they might have been doing for so long, and they have to start from scratch. And we keep saying, oh, but she should have the moral gumption to really do it. Should she? So this raised a lot of questions about the nature of scientific knowledge as it is produced in laboratories and who has control over it. Anyway, so when I asked my respondents, one PI echoed the sentiment of almost all of them. She said, of course there is harassment. What is the magnitude of it? How is the frequency? I don't know. At a relatively early career stage, it needs to be made easier for people to report harassment. The mechanisms have to be clear, transparent, and open, and protection has to be provided and guaranteed. Another informed me that, and I quote, a lot of women who get harassed are students. Their careers depend on the person who's doing the sexual harassment. So they would rather just finish their work and get out. A third said, it's hard for me to think of anything specific to the scientific environment or institute. It exists everywhere. I think as a society, as we change with movements like #MeToo, the impact will also show in scientific institutions. A senior PI said that in a lab, there is a hierarchy with middle-level people like postdocs having power or trainees who are dependent on them for work, and much of the harassment happens at that level. A PI who works with my lab and does a lot of field research feels it is important to make the field visits safe for younger women. The danger of harassment should not come in the way of research that they are doing, and she goes on to add that the inherent power structure in academia, especially for early career researchers, is very bad. Another PI says sexual harassment exists everywhere, but it's more problematic in the academia. If the mentor harasses the mentee, it's not easy for the mentee to rebuild their career elsewhere. It is interesting to note for me that all of them recognize the presence of sexual harassment, and I'm not quite sure whether this got publicly spoken about. Right now it's there in all the 6 YouTube interviews in the public domain. That they recognize that power is operative, they recognize that mechanisms are poor. As we theorize this further, we can make deeper connections of sexual harassment not only to power structures but to the inherent controlling and violent nature of science. I know this will cause some of you to flinch, but I plead with you to view with the necessary rigor it requires to see the connections between violence against nature that I spoke about in yesterday's talk and the violence against women. I move to the second theme on toxicity. My first conversation with a senior male scientist from Veronica was interesting when I was telling him about my desire and need to tell Veronica's story. Veronica, he said, She was the most destructive of people. Taken aback, I absorbed the shock and decided to quote this line of argument. Why do women PIs become toxic? Doesn't it reflect on the situation, the culture of science, and the expectations of the scientists rather than on the women? Then why are they expected not to be toxic? On whom does the onus lie to break the cycle? Because as feminists, one of the important things that we are saying is the cultures of science are extremely toxic. And who has to break the chain? Often the onus lies on women, and women are actually pretty helpless themselves. The PI said there is a smaller sample size for women, and so if a certain proportion of both men and women are going to react to pressure in a certain way by being difficult to work with, or in ways that make them difficult to work with, I think the women are somehow much more of an eyesore to the rest. Another respondent said, if a woman is sounding decisive and articulate, it scares people. And if the same content, even with the same mannerism, is told by a male PI, maybe it doesn't come as a surprise. A third one said, I have read somewhere that I can name my PI friends because it's all on the YouTube, but keeping in mind ethnographic writing, I'm not naming them here. If a woman is sounding, okay, so I have read somewhere that when you're working as a woman, whichever your discipline it may be, you just learn to behave like a woman but think like a man. Okay? I think there's a kind of expectation that women should be more understanding. People have said to me, oh, you're so good with people, so you'll be very good to work with lots of students. And I'm not saying that's a wrong approach. I think every individual has a responsibility in the sense to make environments non-toxic. Toxic, said another one, is used loosely in many cases. For example, you give honest feedback, you're labeled abrasive, and you're labeled as someone who's very arrogant. Some of it is also that the system chooses certain qualities for you. I would say first-gen people, and this I thought was a very important point. I would say first-generation people of both genders, first generation because they would have fought their way to get where they are, and when you're used to clearing the woods and making your own path, you're likely to be a fighter. You won't take things that people say at face value. You would be someone who will want to be assured of what the right path is. You would be someone who's argumentative, who would be someone who would want to be convinced and not sign off on things just because someone said that this was the thing to be done. And these are seen as difficult qualities, especially among women. So do we need women to be caring then, I ask? Because the other thing is that, you're expected to mother, right? The other deep pressure for all of us women in various professions, even in the academia, is that you have to extend the mothering role, and we all resist that, yeah? Especially in a day and time, and believe me, some of the PIs that I interviewed are people who've made conscious decisions on their reproductive roles and consciously decided not to be mothers. So to put the pressure of being mother on them is quite ironic. So I asked, do we women have to be caring? Then I asked, is the burden on us again, once again? As one of them says, I do feel that care about your team is inherent in you being able to lead your team, and the care has to do with the fact that you want your team members to be happily working, not to be instructed to work. Another senior PI talks about how being suggestive rather than instructive has helped her with her lab and interactions with her students. A third, who agrees to academic environment being toxic, says, even from a very practical perspective, even if you're not thinking about society and all that, non-toxic environments bring out the best in people, and you'll be so surprised with how joyous they are. I think that we have to make that conscious choice to not promote toxic environments. Another respondent says, I think women should be more conscious of this and really try to be a little more balanced on this. I wouldn't put the onus completely on the outside. I would put some onus on women also, I mean, why would you allow an outside situation to change your own personality or your own values? So this dilemma about who you become as a professional scientist, as in biology, as somebody who's running a lab, who has to mentor, this big dilemma about how to do it is quite significant for women in science. The last point, that the theme that I pick up on as an important thing for us in feminist science studies, which is to, as I said yesterday, which is to recognize that gender plays a silent, hidden role in not just the way you and I become men and women, or when we choose not to conform to genders, or the relationship between us as men and women. But gender also organizes cognitive and imaginative spaces like science and art and religion, family, marriage. So, feminist theory, when it matured to asking this question, is when we started asking the question of knowledge, making systems of the academia, of disciplines, particularly of science. And one of the things that we recognize is that in the ordering of the disciplines, there is a fair amount of gender discourse. So another theme central to these interviews was how the disciplines get gendered, how the binaries of hard and soft sciences get created. The PIs talked about gendering of disciplines in schools. One of them said, I think the numbers speak for themselves. And I think what they understood as gendering here, you will see as I report the narratives, is where are the women? And there are more women and there are more men. Maybe I was asking the question a little more deeply, and maybe it was my failure that I couldn't really communicate it. So one of them said, I think the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, if you look at it, you know, there are fewer women physicists and women mathematicians than there are women biologists. So for sure it's happening. I think there is definitely a pressure on girls to go into certain areas, first of all, and then there is pressure on girls not to do science, and also, I think, pressure within the scientific disciplines itself. Another respondent says, gendering does exist, but at a career stage that I am at, it doesn't affect me so much. I suspect it plays a much bigger role in our society because as children, when you are a female child or a male child, you may be guided much more in one direction or the other if you have an inclination and an interest in pursuing science. A third says, I would imagine that perhaps the general perception about biology is that it is not as hardcore. It's not perhaps a science that can be proven with expert, hardcore experiments. Therefore, it's considered a soft science. And she says, this according to me is untrue. Another respondent notes on her experiences saying, I think it is true and it's highly observed even today. I can remember that when I was doing my postdoctoral tenure in the UK in Cambridge, it's a big lab and we had several floors, and the same lab could do some physics, could do some computing, mathematics, and also wet lab biology. I was trying to note that the wet lab biology had maximum number of women. Another respondent says that certain aspects of science are being perceived as masculine and others as feminine. I was so happy to see this much recognition. I work on tigers, and that's like carnivores, and it's like super macho. You're in this jeep and you're driving, air in your hair. It's a very macho, like catching animals, collaring them. There are some fields perceived as very macho. Fieldwork in general is perceived as very macho. Another one takes a more historical approach and says, if you were living in the 19th, and the previous narrative also adds how therefore it's odd to be a woman in that space. Fieldwork in general is perceived, another respondent takes a historical approach and says, if you were living in the 19th century, for example, biology would also have been seen as a masculine subject. I mean, there were so few women biologists back then. The involvement of women in science as a whole was very minuscule. And even when they were involved, they were probably helping their husbands in the lab and not really taking credit for what they were doing. So today biology is seen as a feminine subject, but it was not so in the previous centuries because they were not there. And who is to say that in the coming centuries there will be more? There could be more women physicists, more women mathematicians, and then it would be seen as a less masculine subject. So you see what happens here is that the idea of the gendering of discipline is connected to who gets to do that discipline. When I asked about the relationship between biology and physics, something that is a pet favorite of mine, but also because NCBS has the Science Center there, one of the responses said that it is, and in fact I feel that it is possible physics has had its golden days much earlier than biology. If I think about the general public, people would know the names of Isaac Newton, Einstein, even if they don't really have an understanding of what gravity or relativity or quantum is, but the names are known, and the imagination is that they discovered something fundamental. So a bit like glamour, and I think about it in contrast. If you look at biology, most of it's perceived from the medicinal discovery, which is more like correlational, observational, things that you have seen and correlated and found so far, mostly. And this also brought to me the idea of the popular imagination of who is a scientist is quite actually dominated by the physicist. Another respondent says, one pattern that I do think sort of supersedes all of these other patterns, if they do exist, is that I think in every field of biology, somehow the hot topics or the most of what is considered the forefront topics, the exciting ones, somehow has an overrepresentation of men in pretty much every subject. Now, how much of that is because there are more men in general in sciences at a level of faculty or senior faculty, and how much of it is that they are more successful at promoting the work that they are doing as being like, the best and the cutting edge, I don't know. For example, she says, in biology, especially at this moment in time, there are a lot of people who have come in from physics background, and I have very rarely met in biology anybody who's a woman who was a physicist before and has come into biology. There is one in NCBS who has moved from chemistry. Yeah. Again, I don't know what is the root of that, of course. This is my experience. It may not be reflective of the bigger reality. But I know several men who are now biologists and have come from a physics background or a mathematics background. They are often the ones who are doing a lot of very quantitative work, quantitative heavy kind of biology, which I guess comes from their training and their natural interest in those kinds of data sets and asking those kinds of questions more. And I'm curious, I'm not aware of a study to address this, but I'm curious whether that has changed a certain subfield or a subfield to have a push towards being more, I guess, the rating of what is considered top-notch biology in that area. Has that changed as a result of the influx of people who come from that training and that background? Whether it is gendered, I don't know, because I don't have a comparison group in my observation. I don't know many women, female physicists or biologists who have become biologists, so I don't have that entire research topic to be worked upon. A third says biology is considered a soft science. In fact, I've had this experience where I've had a conversation with a well-known physicist actually in India who said, anyway, it's good that all this, we must pursue these soft sciences like ecology. I mean, I think, she says, binning anything into this or that, I don't think works. But the fact that the binning happens needs to be acknowledged. A fourth says, and brings forward the point, of comparison between biology and mathematics. I don't have a clear-cut answer for that, but one thing I could say is biology is very observation-oriented. This again is a very important point, very thought-provoking. She says, I don't have a clear-cut answer for that, but one thing I could say is biology is very observation-oriented, whereas something like mathematics or physics probably is more abstract. And so what goes into biology is different from what goes into mathematics. It would also be, she says, a question about confidence. I mean, I see a big chasm, she says, in terms of levels of confidence between men and women, boys and girls. She says, I don't know if that's cultural or biological or developmental. You know, any of these things could sculpt the way women perceive themselves. And if you're not sure of yourself, then you're not likely, and this is interesting, to go into something that's very abstract than into something that's observational, where you can check, right? I observed, she says, this, and I found this, what she's saying is that I think it's easier for women to say, I observed this and I found this, and somebody else can observe it and verify whether that is correct. So I feel more sure-footed in what I do. I don't know if this is true, that's a viewpoint, that's all. So, that really is the end of what I have to say today, except to say that these interviews provide us a very nuanced understanding. We can have the lights. Provide us a very nuanced understanding of the experiences of women in doing science. These are just the YouTube interviews. I also did some archival interviews, basically interviews with which contain material which is not necessarily something that the women would have wanted to share for public. And those were also, for me methodologically, those interviews were done to get a worldview of the worldview that women in science work with, where we raised and discussed larger questions about the role of science in society, the place of emotions, the place of faith and religion, politics, a set of questions that I also asked the male PIs in the part of my work that I shall speak about tomorrow. So that's really it. And once again, Leela Hulugan, who says that talks are very uneasy for ethnographers, really. We like to tell stories, we like to tell little mischievous things here and there. But so this was an attempt to bring together the way I approached the field NCBS in the last 1 year. I, of course, use the ethnographic method as opposed to the historical method. It's difficult to do that because when you're located in an archives, the domination of history is huge. And while these methods, as I said yesterday, they have common things in the historical method and in the ethnographic method, we both do qualitative work, we both do work about context. The sources are different. Historical methods often rely on documents, written material, text, archives, and the ethnographer relies on interviews, conversations, observations, field notes, generating audiovisual material. They are two very different methods and give you very different insights. So, in a sense, the challenge was also to probably persuade my field that this is a valid method. It's not just, oh, you ask some questions, people tell you some stories, what's the big deal, you know. So the journey has been interesting and complex. So thank you for listening.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I shall bring the mic. Just a small observation. Thank you, ma'am. I have my daughter here who's in 9th, and she just told me that she observes that all her physics teachers are male and all her bio teachers are females. So just an observation she made from your talk.
Yeah, that's actually very, very interesting that all her physics teachers are male and her biology teachers are all female. But you know what? Actually, you will find that teachers generally are women, even in physics. And I feel like I was saying yesterday, it's a very interesting phenomenon, how research gets masculinized once again because it's seen as a male thing. and teaching gets feminized. I have so many stories that I can tell you about young couples who marry when they are young postdocs, meet in the world of physics, biology, chemistry, whatever. And because of what is known as a two-body problem, very often the man gets a position in a research institute and the woman goes with him to the city and finds a job in a college and teaches or at a university. So this is a very, very interesting thing that we observe all the time. And so for you, I want to say, young lady, that the point is that there is a lot of literature. Have you read Zuban's little book based on Lilavati's daughters, which is a book brought out by Rohini Gurbuge and Ram Ramaswamy? Zuban, the feminist publisher, has brought out this very little lovely book about biographical, or small autobiographical essays of women in science. But this literature is also aimed at building a heroine narrative, you know, about how this woman actually overcame all the struggles and pursued a career in science, and you know, she thanks her family extensively. All this is very valuable. But the point is, it doesn't really prepare the women who are entering science with the kind of challenges that they need to be prepared for. I remember, and I'll share this anecdote with you, several years ago, in a conference on mathematics actually, organized by women mathematicians. Some of us were asked to come, you know, the social scientists, to tell you what to do. So we were happily went there, and one of my colleagues in very, very rabid critic of maths, and you know, said that mathematics is a universe which is highly casteist, it's patriarchal, and my organizing friend sitting next to me nudged me and said, "You don't go up and say this." So I said, "Why?" She's telling the truth, no? She said, no, this idea here in this conference is not to put off young people from mathematics, young girls. If you guys come and say this kind of thing, it puts people off. So I'm struck by this fact about how you need to create this illusion of a girl who has to pursue science. It's a beautiful thing to pursue. And one thing that I have learned in the last 1 year also, that I had learned in my PhD phase also, is the immense passion with which people in science actually do science, men and women. So I think that is what should be encouraged and seen through. Thank you for that observation.
Hi. I love that little point. I'm captivated by it. You spoke about the dilemma of if that person didn't consider herself a feminist in her context, but when you speak about her, you know, you're in that dilemma of, in your context, and when you're portraying that person, it is a feminist idea, or she is a feminist to you. How did you resolve that dilemma?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because that has been a question that has actually, you know, sort of been very difficult for us who are doing feminist retrievals of women in any field. So in sociology, for example, in Reimagining Sociology, the volume that I edited with Joseph, there's an entire section on early women in sociology. Yeah, and the attempt has been to sort of retrieve their voices for a feminist purpose, with the full recognition that their lives were, for example, extremely different. So, for example, Lilavati Karve's life, and she was devoted and dedicated to her husband, and she was all of that, you know, the Mangal Sutra wearing, everything, and yet she did some extremely important work. Also, the kind of challenges that early women had, for example, the story of C. Parvatamma in sociology, who was a Dalit, first Dalit woman sociologist, who actually didn't want to work on caste because she came necessarily from a Dalit background. She actually wanted to work on the other issues. So, so it is a dilemma. It is difficult. difficulty, and one has to be very careful about not over-reading feminism into their work, but reading their work, visibilizing it for the discipline. So one of the arguments that we did, for example, for sociology is, why don't we teach these women in regular courses in sociology? Because their work is not seen as theoretical and abstract enough. But then we need to change the way we look at our discipline and not just look at it as theoretical and abstract and all of that, but that there are other ways of doing sociology. For example, women in sociology were very, very involved in voluntary work outside of sociology. They were doing sociology but outside of the academic space. How do we bring that work in? Yeah? But the challenge doesn't stop at retrieving women from history. The challenge is also today. A lot of women in science, in sociology, in every other discipline will tell you, I don't want the label, no. I don't want to be a feminist sociologist, I'm a sociologist. I don't want to be a feminist biologist, I'm a biologist. A lot of women go through this. So how do you understand that? Yeah, how do you bring? So I'd simply say that it's important to visualize all contributions of women, feminist or not feminist. But the feminist contribution, and that is a feminist act, to visualize the work. You get my point? And a feminist would be doing different kind of work. They, for example, would be asking questions differently, as I said in the beginning, whether in biology or in sociology or history. But the idea of at least visualizing, retrieving their work is a real feminist act. Does that answer you somewhat? But it's not easy. Yeah?
Thank you so much. It was such an insightful talk. I want to bring us back to the point you raised about toxicity. I understand how assertive women are looked down upon, and you mentioned this statement that women are still expected to think like a man but behave like a woman.
One of my respondents said that.
Yes. I was wondering if we can also approach this from a different angle, because I have worked as an academic researcher for a fairly long time when I was doing my PhD in molecular biology, but then soon after I transitioned to the pharmaceutical industry. And one trend that I have seen frequently is that senior, like PIs, women researchers or women in leadership roles in the corporate, I also feel that they sometimes tend to overcompensate. They take stances of, they demonstrate authority and take stricter policies or stricter, harsher stances just to counteract the biases. So would you like to speak about that for a little while?
Yeah, of course. One of the respondents, in fact, said this to me in the interviews that, you know, this happens everywhere, happens in the corporate world, happens in the IT world. She says that it's a little different in the academic world, because her argument is that in the corporate world or in more open-ended professional spaces, you can actually quit a job, take another one. Whereas in academia you can't. That's her assertion. But coming to your point, we all know that the more marginal you are, the doubly you have to prove yourself. That you have to justify that you are in this place and it is your right to be there. Otherwise you're constantly anyway going through an imposter syndrome. That I came here by influence, I came here by luck, I came here this, I came here that, right? So anybody who comes from a marginal location tends to overcompensate, you know, tends to sort of play the game much harder. Whether they need to or they do not need to is a different question, yeah? But they tend to do that. In fact, in the PW issue, Women's Studies, which Asha and I edited, where we invited women in biology, those who had left it, in physics, those who left it, to come up with some paired narratives about their experiences in science. And one of the physicists, Madhu Rao, speaks in that volume, in that essay, and says that it's very interesting how in the classroom, if she is tempted, if she is softer, her students don't take her seriously. They think of it as a sign of not knowing what you're talking about. Yeah, you have to come off as being assertive, strong. So it's a complex question that women tend to do that, and they do it much more because they almost need to do it. If they are not going to do it, they generally don't get hurt. In my own academic context, I was often told, why do you fight so much? Why do you make trouble? Very Baba, what to do? You won't hear me, no, if I don't shout. So I have to shout louder to be heard, and I will make trouble because you are making trouble. So these are difficult things for women to navigate. The question, however, that we are asking at a more fundamental level is, can we continue inertia in this toxic, reproducing these toxic cultures? Obviously we don't want to, right? It doesn't fit with our feminist worldviews, with our moral values. But the question is, who has to change it and how will the change break? The onus on women is a bit unfair. And toxicity affects men as much.
Thank you very much.
Can't hear it.
Is this better? I was curious to understand if you saw a difference between the men you interviewed and the women you interviewed on the topic of diversity. Do they still think of it? Is their thinking still that it is upliftment of the downtrodden? Or do they see diversity as a virtue in itself?
It's a very, very important question. Please come tomorrow. Women definitely see diversity as absolutely central to ensure their participation, a full-throated, full-hearted participation in science. But they are very, very skeptical about tokenism. You know what I mean? They're very, very skeptical, and they're tired of being that tokenistic woman on all committees, right? You have to go and represent the woman question. So they are tired. And I would argue saying that this diversity thing, equity, inclusiveness is very important, but often it is practiced very conditionally. It doesn't really ensure a pluralism. What it does is it says, now you're here, come, but you play our game. We are not going to change the game for you. Yeah? The game remains the way it is. You play it. And if you get it right, good. If you don't get it right, again you're in trouble. Do the men look at it differently from the women? Yes. But they also all agree with the need, at least this is my good fortune, of the people that I interviewed at NCBS, who almost talk about diversity. And it's very hard for me to say this, but honestly, the NCBS, if you even look at the website, is doing way better on diversity than some of the other institutions. And yet, we all recognize that there's a long way to go. A related question, though, is a question of privilege. See, why we have more women coming into science? They are generally upper caste women. Yeah. And it will take some time for that to break. Yeah. Even the men that we see, even today, are largely Hindu men, Hindu upper caste men. Hindu upper caste men dominate physics. They come from Bengal. Mathematics, they come from Tamil Nadu. There will be that or Punjabi or Gujarati. But there is a domination of certain communities. And as I was saying yesterday, that there could be sociological and historical reasons for this. They are not because these men are innately God-given gifts, genetically endowed and all that. There are sociological and historical reasons for that to have happened. But why is it continuing to happen? And our submission is that because they keep it like that. It's gated. And they say that it is based on merit, which is humble.
I'm not quite sure how to frame the question, but are there forums or are there spaces where women who identify themselves as feminist scientists, as feminist scientists, and those who don't, who are simply women in science, do we see any kind of conversation happening?
Maya, I personally don't think as yet we have feminist biologists, except we have Samira here, young biologist who has convinced me that she's the first feminist biologist that I have. We don't have feminist biologists. We don't have feminist physicists for sure in India as yet. And I think if you look at the way the feminist biologists developed in, say, in the US, for example, they developed like everywhere else in any discipline. They developed with a deep connection with the movement, with the women's movement in that country, in that space. What happens in science is that because it is seen as such an apolitical activity, okay, mostly scientific, I'm not generalizing, but the general understanding of people in science is that they will not get involved with politics. It's seen to be as taking them away from science, contaminated. So the link with the movement is very poor. So I'd say that if you believe the project of STEMinism, then women in science are doing a lot. There are a lot of organizations, Indian Association of Women in Astrophysics, Women in Physics, Women in Mathematics. They are all organizing themselves very well to take up feminist issues of the two-body problem, representation, awards, etc., etc. They are talking about all of that. And they have regular meetings, and these meetings are very charged wherever I've been, and I think we should be writing a history of them actually. But they are not bending the discipline as yet. In fact, the people that I mentioned, whether it's Prajwal Shastri, Shobna Narasimhan, Rohini Bhole, Vinita Bal, for example, a lot of them doing excellent work in representational questions. But when it comes, and the dialogue between them and us, at the tension point is when we say, look at your discipline critically. Look at the fact that your research design might be skewed towards a bias because you're looking only at the male sample of the rats. Look at, for example, how you're theorizing on the female brain. Are you looking at the female brain in the tiger or the mouse or whatever? So those are difficult conversations, not yet happening. But if the question of representation, which is, like I said, a very important question, yeah, that conversations are happening regularly. There are associations, professional associations, all there. And they ask questions about why, for example, Bhatnagar awards are given only to men. We asked Bhatnagar awards, I think there was not a single woman there. Very interesting.
It was just such a fabulous talk.
Where are you?
I'm here.
Ah, okay.
That light is a problem. You know, everything you spoke about touched my life at so many points that I don't know how I can, you know, even I probably have to go back home and write down. At this point, it happened.
You can write to me. I'll be happy to discuss.
Lovely. You know, like way back in the 70s, I was doing my PhD in the IISc, and I used to slog in an experimental lab from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening.
Right.
And there would be guys who'd come from the hostel at 4 p.m. and leave at 10 p.m. Now, according to my simple math, I work longer hours than them. But because they went back to the hostel at, you know, 11 p.m., oh, they are so hardworking. Look at these women, they look at their watches and they're going home at 6:37. So from that point onwards, the second thing I wanted to say is I had the privilege of knowing Anna Mani very well. She was a very close family friend. And she was this wonderful person who not only did brilliant science, she read poetry, she enjoyed classical music. She told me when I was dubofied in Leon Uris at age 13, there is something that's happening in Palestine, Rinti, you need to read about it. So she was this amazing person who combined, you know, it's not like she was a scientist and she knew everything. So I think as a personal narrative of someone who bridged, you know, across things, she was a superb example. And my last and very quick point is, do they do awareness training on Posh W at NCBS?
So I'll come with the last one first.
Only comments.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I asked the sexual harassment question was also because very early on in my fieldwork here, I attended a session. I mean, after my years of experience with the Women's Development Cell in the university and looking at the POSH Act and looking at the UGC guidelines and all of that, the POSH Act and the guidelines itself are very difficult to put into practice, say in a place like a university where you don't even have women professors. Where will you have them functioning as POs? In any space you don't have that problem. Almost every woman is a professor. Yeah. Mechanism is weak. And they are aware of that. The other question of women and men's time, yeah, I mean, it's endless, you know. I mean, men are able to do a lot of the boys' club networking because there's somebody cooking at home for them, so they can have odd hours, they can go away. We need to go back home, 5, 6. It's there. It's all of it is there. And, you know, women feel the pressure. So, but thank you for sharing that, and please do write to me, and I'll be quite happy to engage and respond.
Hello. I'm curious to know more about what you mean by a feminist scientist bending the discipline.
A feminist scientist?
Bending the discipline. And I'm wondering whether that relates to the expectation of think like a man while behaving like a woman. Okay, those were two different things. Okay, I'll stick to what I was asking first, that bending the discipline. I do have seen examples of that in psychology. For instance, Carol Gilligan questioning Kohlberg's theory of morality, or how Karen Horney questioned Freud. But in a hard science like hard sciences, my understanding was that there are standards and processes to make it as objective as possible. So does that still apply? How does that still apply here?
Yeah, I wish I could bring back yesterday's talk, but I think it's a very important question. What does it mean to bend the discipline from a feminist perspective? I know what it means to do that in sociology, right? Because we have actually done it. What does it mean in biology? The biologist has to do that. But in terms of broad stroke principles, it is about examining the existing theories that are there from the standpoint of women, to try and see whether enough of women's voices, experiences were actually understood or not. See, there is always in every science a very fundamental base level where probably gender doesn't matter. And one has to concede that. But there is a lot of science that we do where we deal with behavior, where we deal with manifestation of structures, cellular structures, hormonal patterns, whatever. So how do you look at that from feminist perspective? So a lot of work that has been done in feminist biology, for example, has been to question evolutionary theories, emphasis on competition as a principle for species survival. And a lot of women have argued, saying, for example, population was not given enough attention, probably because Darwin didn't want to do it, and the evolutionary theorists, not because they consciously had some patriarchal intent, but that's the way they looked at the world. Yeah? So we have to sort of, a lot of feminist doings in any discipline are corrective. In a way, correcting the kind of theories that exist from the standpoint of women. And a lot of feminist biologists, for example, I mean, people like Samira will be able to tell us more about it. For example, just simple question about, are you taking the female sample or not into the research that you're doing? You generally don't. You take the male sample and you universalize, right? Early anatomy studies, for example, criticism of the history of anatomy from feminist perspectives will tell us that women's only the reproductive parts, organs were studied, right? Because that is the way they were looked at. That is the value of their existence. Their brains were not studied. Yeah? So there are different ways in which you can question, challenge the theories of the discipline by bringing in voices of women and other marginal groups. It doesn't have to be only gender, it can be race, it can be caste, it can be many things. Yeah? So bending on discipline is doing your, as I said earlier, asking different questions from the reality and asking different questions and doing a different kind of science. Samira had pointed out to me about bird calls, right, Samira? About how desire, you want to talk about it a little bit? Just 1 or 2 sentences. I know she's very hesitant, but please give her the mic. You know, just to give you an insight about how it can be corrected or done.
This is an answer to the question before. I just wanted to also add, since I have the mind, that psychology can also be considered a hard science. So I'm not sure where that distinction that you made came from, but something to think about. I study bird song, and there are other biologists abroad, not in India, who have shown how the history of the study of bird song and bird behavior is influenced by the gender of the people who studies it. So for the longest time, male birds, the focus was on male birds singing to attract females, whereas now we know that a lot of females in many species of birds also sing for different reasons, sometimes than the males. And that was discovered only when women started studying birds and bird behavior.
Thanks, Alina. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Chadha and the entire team at NCBS for bringing today's session to the IC. Thank you to the audience for spending your evening with us. Good night.